Right now we want to take our Bibles and open up to Deuteronomy chapter 20. In seeking the Lord about what to present on this special service to our veterans, I thought about what qualities make a good soldier. What qualities would you say a good soldier needs? You say you need obedience, right? And loyalty, faithfulness. And I was thinking about preaching on one of those topics, and then in the middle of the night, one other quality came to me. That's the quality of courage. It takes courage to be a good soldier, doesn't it? In fact, you probably can't be a good soldier without courage. We want to look at what God has to say about courage in Deuteronomy 20. He's speaking to the nation of Israel. Follow along with me as I start at verse 1, Deuteronomy 21. When you go out to battle against your enemies and see horses and chariots and people more numerous than you, do not be afraid of them. For the Lord your God, who brought you up from the land of Egypt, is with you. When you are approaching the battle, the priest shall come near and speak to the people. He shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are approaching the battle against your enemy today. Do not be faint-hearted. Do not be afraid or panic or tremble before them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies and to save you. Here then we have a passage given to Israel, and it's about courage. It's about courage. If I asked you to come up here and define what courage is, what would you say courage is? What's courage? We've all seen courage. The soldier on the battlefield who runs to fight, that's courage. The firefighter who runs into a burning building, that's courage. A Christian student who stands alone for her faith at school, that's courage. God says to Israel here, as you look at your enemies, I'm giving you a command. He says, do not be afraid of them. Do not be faint-hearted. Do not panic. And do not tremble. In other words, be courageous. That's what God is saying. Israel needed as they would meet all these different enemies that they were going into the land of Canaan to face. They needed courage. And we need courage too, don't we? Every Christian needs courage. We face enemies. We face difficulties. We face trials. And just like you can't be a good soldier without being courageous, you can't be a good Christian. You can't be a successful Christian without being courageous. Courage is a huge part of living the Christian life successfully. So this morning we want to look at the subject of courage in the time we have left. We're going to look at what it is, why we need it, and where we get it. What it is, why we need it, where we get it. Courage. Let's look at this together. Number one in your insert, what courage is. I did some reading on courage and found out that courage really has to have three parts in order to have courage. Number one, and this is in your insert, the first part is a challenge. In order to have courage, you need a challenge that is facing you. You don't need courage to tie your shoes. You don't need courage to walk in the park. Why? Because those things aren't a challenge to us. They aren't difficult. They aren't hard. Courage requires something hard to do that lies in front of us. So the soldier who has a battle in front of him, the firefighter who has the fire, the Christian student who has the glares of non-Christians around her, those are challenges that require dealing with an issue. For us, it might be you want to witness to someone at work. That's a challenge. It might be that you have a fellow Christian who has a sin problem, and you know that you need to speak to them about it. In order to have courage, you have to start with a challenge, something that's challenging you there. Our passage has Israel facing an enemy, a real literal enemy. And in our passage, it isn't just a regular battle that you would expect. It says there in verse 1, they have horses, chariots, and people more numerous than you. All right, so they're not just going into battle, they're outnumbered. And we can go into our lives feeling overwhelmed and outnumbered by things that stand in front of us. Okay, then that situation is one that qualifies as needing courage. So number one starts with a challenge. Number two, the second part in your insert there is a fear. In order to have courage, you have to have a challenge and then have fear that comes as a result of that challenge. Again, taking a walk in the park or digging a ditch. Digging a ditch can be a challenge. Okay. But are you afraid of digging a ditch? No, because there's not really any risk involved for most people in digging a ditch. In order to have fear or a challenge that requires courage, you have to have fear about it. It's where you look at the situation and you realize there are risks involved if I do this. With Israel, there's a risk involved if I head out into the face of this overwhelming army that is in front of me. Certain things are just risky. A loaded gun is risky. A rattlesnake is risky. A battlefield. Those are all risky, and it is proper to have fear toward these things so you handle them in a proper way. And witnessing to a non-Christian is risky. Telling a fellow Christian about the sin problem that you've noticed in their life, that's risky. In order to have courage, number one, you have to have a challenge, and then have the right fear about that challenge, that you realize there's risk involved. Having fear shows that you understand that this is a risky situation. And then the third part, in your insert again, of courage is a choice to do the right thing anyway. So you have a challenge, you have a fear of that challenge, and then you choose to do the right thing anyway, even though it's fearful. So imagine that you have a Christian that you know at work or in your family, and they are regularly not treating another person kindly. And you've observed this, that they'll be having a normal day, and then this particular person comes along, and they don't treat them well. They don't speak to them well. They're kind of harsh with them and sharp with them. And it isn't just a one-time thing, but a pattern thing. Now, you realize you should probably say something to this fellow Christian, because that's not the proper way to act. God knows that. But number two, fear comes along. Because, what would I say? How would I approach that? What would I do? What if they get mad at me and start mistreating me? But then, third, you can dig deep. And you can find the strength to overcome the fear and do the right thing and speak to them in a gentle and kind way about a problem that you see in their life. What do we call the strength that overcomes fear and does the right thing anyway? That's courage. Courage is the strength, this is in your insert, courage is strength to overcome fear, to do the right thing. That's what courage is. It's strength. It doesn't mean that you're not afraid. Please hear that. Courage does not mean that you're not afraid. It means that you overcome your fear to do the right thing anyway. I've shared before the story of how years ago we had a Gideon come to speak while I was away one Sunday, and he challenged the people in the congregation to give away pocket New Testaments that the Gideons often use. And one of the men in our church felt that God was laying that upon his heart, that he needed to give some Bibles away, and there was one particular woman that he knew that he said she really needs a Bible. And he felt like God was putting it upon his heart how to do that, and he wasn't quite sure. The thought made him feel uncomfortable. How would you approach that? How do you, just walk up to someone? What do you say? What if they don't want it? What if they, get hostile or whatever? But he felt God was placing this upon his heart to be able to do this. And so he was thinking about, how to approach it when he was at a restaurant one night, and he looked across the room, and there was the woman sitting at a table eating, and he thought, I've got one of those pocket testaments right here. And he was wondering how could he do it, and then he noticed that she stood up and she was walking by and would be walking right by his table, and he's like all nervous and he doesn't know what to say, and she walks right by and he doesn't say anything, completely loses his nerve to say anything. And then he gets disgusted with himself and he jumps to his feet and takes along the little Bible and he follows her, and came to a spot where she had stopped and paused, and he, politely introduced himself and said, I had an experience at church the other week where a speaker encouraged us to give Bibles to people, and I just wondered if you would accept this Bible from me. I'd like to give you this little Bible. And she agreed, and she even thanked him. And he went back to his seat just full of joy. He'd overcome his fear. That is an example of courage. It's not where you're not afraid. It's where you find strength to dig deep and overcome the fear and do the right thing anyway. That's what courage is. Number 2 on your insert is why we need courage. Why do we need courage? And it's very simple, and this is what I put in there. Because fear stands against our doing what is right. Fear stands against our doing what is right. Fear stood against this man giving away God's word. God had laid it on his heart, and you know Satan was right there to try to get him to be quiet, turn the other way, don't deal with this. And yet he found courage to be able to overcome that. God knew that fear would keep Israel from going into battle. Remember, he wanted the land cleared of these pagan nations. And so he said, Israel, I want you to go make peace with them, and if they won't accept peace, then you battle with them. But fear could keep them from doing God's will, and that's why he gave them this passage. And we all know that there are times in our lives when we have not done something that God wanted us to do, had in front of us, because of fear. I think you can think of examples in your life where you backed down because of fear. You were too afraid. Maybe there was a new job position opened up and you looked at yourself and you said, I could never do that. What if I failed? I couldn't do that. And maybe you let that go. Or a witnessing opportunity to be able to speak to someone about Christ and you thought, well, what if I say the wrong thing, and you let that go. Or maybe it was a situation where you had a ministry opportunity here at church and someone asked you to do it and you thought about it, and you let it go. There are many times in our Christian lives when we let fear stop us from doing what God puts in front of us. So that's why we need courage, because fear regularly stands in the way of our accomplishing what God wants us to do. And then the last question I have on your insert is, where do we get courage? Okay, here's what it is. Here's why we need it. But where do we get it? Where do you get courage? Is it just your own character that does it? Well, if you'll notice in the passage, it mentions twice why Israel should not be afraid. Did you notice that? He says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, don't be afraid, don't be afraid. And 2 times it says why he shouldn't be afraid. Verse 1 says, do not be afraid of them, for, here it is, because the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt is with you. Because the Lord your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt is with you. Read verse 4 again, along with me as I read. It says, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to save you. That's why you should not be afraid. What is it that God promises to his people when we face challenges that we're afraid of? Him. He says, I'll be with you. Where do we get courage? We get courage from God's presence being with us. And that's in your insert. Where do we get courage? From God's presence with us to give us victory. Where do we get courage? By God saying, I'm going to be with you. If you have God with you, maybe you can think of something that scares you right now, and it's in front of you. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ this morning, he's not only your Lord, Master, and God, he's also with you to give you 2 things. Number 1, to give you strength. Strength. It isn't just, well, I'm there with you. I'm there with you with my strength, he says. Look at verse 4 again. God says, I will fight for you. Can you imagine God fighting for you? This says God will fight for you as a Christian. And not just the God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. This is the God who already has shown his great power through all the plagues and all the signs and wonders and the parting of the sea. I'm going to be with you, God says. All my strength is going to be with you. That's why you shouldn't be afraid, Israel. And the second thing was not only God's strength, but his control. Look at the last words of verse 4. It says, I will go with you to save you. The NIV says, to give you victory. I will give you victory, God says. How did God say that before a battle even took place? I'll be there with you to give you victory. Well, how could he know that? Because God controls everything. God is the one who controls the outcome of a battle. You see that many times in the Old Testament where Israel goes up against enemies that they should never have beaten, and they beat them. Why? Because God controls the outcomes of battle. It's not the enemy who controls it. It's not demons that control it. It's not the weather that controls it. It's not morale or supplies or whatever it is. God has the final last word about who wins battles. And God says, look, when you, Israel, go into battle, I am with you. I'm with you with my strength that can do anything. And I'm with you with my control that determines the outcome of what's going to happen. And I've already determined you're going to have victory. That's what God says. This means that no matter what we face in life, it's going to end up in victory if we're dependent upon God. Here's Israel. Where are they going to get their courage? They're going to depend upon God, call upon Him to come. And so, okay, we're facing an overwhelming army in front of us. We are outnumbered. We cannot naturally win. But you know what? We're going to depend upon God, hold on to courage because His power and His control is with us. And so for you and me, when you face some fear that's in front of you, it's a fear of failure, fear of rejection, fear of suffering, whatever it might be, you can say, okay, this really scares me to step forward into this, but I'm going to dig deep and I'm going to depend upon God, find that strength because I'm not alone in this. God's great strength is with me, and God's great control is with me, and He says this is going to end in victory. No matter what we face as Christians, when we depend upon God, it will end in victory. Now you might say, wait a minute, Pastor, hold on. Did you just say, if you depend upon God, you will always have your situation end in victory? Because I can think of lots of times when people depended upon God and it didn't end in victory, it ended in defeat. Look at John the Baptist. He goes out and he preaches for God, ends up being thrown in jail, and then having his head chopped off. That did not end well for John the Baptist. Paul goes out and he preaches. He's thrown in jail and beaten, thrown in jail and beaten, thrown in jail and beaten, time without number, and he ultimately is killed by the Roman Empire. Peter is crucified. Stephen is stoned to death. Pastor, how can you say that if you just depend upon God and move forward, that it's always going to end in victory? Well, that is true if you have the right view of time. If you have the short view of time, then you're right. John the Baptist ended in defeat, and Peter and Paul and Stephen, they all ended in defeat if you have the short view of time. But if you have the proper view of time, then you understand those men their lives didn't end the day their bodies died. Those men entered into the glories of heaven, welcomed by God to great celebration and victory. And that did end in victory, great victory for them. And it's still going on today. God tells us that we may step forward depending upon Him and go through a dark valley before we get to our victory. But it will always end in victory. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes the day you step forward in courage, it's great victory right there immediately and everyone rejoices. Sometimes it's dark, and it's very dark. But God says, you depend upon me, I will always see to it that you end in great victory. Even if it's in heaven, that's the greatest victory we can have. It does not end in defeat. Let me finish the story about the man who gave away the Bible. He overcame his fear. He stood up, he went to that woman, and she took the Bible and went back to her seat, and he returned to his table just full of joy and happiness. About 10 minutes later, her husband comes up to him with the Bible in his hand, and he is really angry. And the Christian man, stood up, and this guy is saying, "How dare you do this? Who do you think you are, giving my wife a Bible? You think you're better than we are?" And as he has this Bible in his hand, he's gesturing, and he hit the man a couple times in the throat with it as he's venting his anger and rage at this man, and he eventually shoves him and stomps away in anger. And the Christian man sat down in his seat, just overwhelmed with feeling terrible and horrible. And he went home just feeling awful. However, in the next few days, he began hearing from people who were at the restaurant. And they said, look, we saw what was happening. We felt so bad for you. That man was totally out of line. The way you responded was so godly. And we overheard what you did. There was nothing wrong with what you did. You did it in a beautiful way. And he got several people calling him and talking about that. Even weeks later, people would stop and say that he did the right thing, and that this couple was out of line, and that they had known that they'd have other problems in their life, and that they needed something like this Bible to be able to help them out. Sometimes when you stand up and be courageous and do the right thing, it doesn't go well in the short run. But God promises, you depend upon me and move forward in obedience to me, you always end at the destination of victory. You always will. So this morning, it takes courage to have a good soldier, and it takes courage to have a good Christian. You cannot live a successful Christian life without courage. Is there something in front of you that has you afraid? Something that is maybe very clear in the Bible that you should do, and you just are not doing it? Or maybe it's something God has laid upon your heart, like that man giving away a Bible. And you know God wants you to do it, and you just are pushing it away because of fear. May I encourage you to listen to the same words that God says in this passage to these Israelites. He says, don't be afraid. Don't be faint-hearted. Don't panic. Don't tremble. That's what God says to you this morning. Instead, dig deep. Find strength to overcome that fear by really realizing God is with you. God is with you. In all of his strength and all of his control, he is with you. And if you will step out in faith, he will not let you down. He will see that it ends in victory for you. Maybe right at the moment you do it, but maybe not. But absolutely it'll come later, if his plan is for you to face some suffering for what you've done first. I encourage you this morning, don't let fear keep you from doing what God wants you to do. Tell him, as we go to prayer in a minute, tell him that you're going to step out and do the right thing anyway. And depend upon his presence to be with you. He loves you. He's faithful and loyal to those who depend upon him. Step out in faith. Do the courageous thing. And don't let fear defeat you anymore.